The accusation that shook Vermont Street. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant chimney smoke as Vermont Street basked in the golden embrace of a late afternoon sun. The peaceful scene, however, was about to be shattered in a way no one could have anticipated. A sudden commotion rippled through the neighborhood, drawing curious eyes from porches and windows. It started with a woman's sharp, frantic voice cutting through the usual suburban hum of distant lawnmowers and passing cars. "That's my dog. He stole my Daisy." The accusation rang out, freezing the small crowd that had begun to gather near the corner of Vermont and Maple. At the center of it all, a man knelt on the pavement, his weathered hands gently wrapped around the golden retriever's collar. He was visibly unkempt, his graying beard thick, his plaid shirt tattered at the edges, and his boots scuffed from too many miles walked without rest. His face, marked by both hardship and wisdom, held an expression that was neither fear nor aggression, but something else entirely, something unreadable to those who didn't know his story. Sarah Thompson, her face flushed with both panic and fury, stood a few feet away, her phone still gripped in her trembling hand. The screen showed an active call -911 was on the line. The crowd, once just curious onlookers, had now become something else entirely. Their smartphones were raised, their eyes flicking between Sarah and the man in question. Some whispered among themselves, others simply watched in silence, waiting for the inevitable escalation. The golden retriever, Daisy, sat patiently, her tail giving an occasional wag, seemingly unaware of the storm unfolding around her. But what stood out most wasn't that she was being restrained, it was that she wasn't trying to escape. She wasn't cowering, whimpering, or pulling away. Instead, she leaned into the man's hold, as if she trusted him. For a brief moment, confusion flickered across Sarah's face, but it was quickly replaced by determination. "Don't you dare move," she warned, her voice rising. "The police are on their way." The homeless man made no attempt to flee. Instead, he slowly lifted his eyes, meeting Sarah's fiery gaze with an unsettling calm. "I didn't steal your dog," he said, his voice steady. But his words did nothing to slow the chaos unraveling around him. A community divided. By now, the street had turned into a stage, with neighbors lining up along sidewalks, peeking over fences, and whispering among themselves. The weight of perception hung in the air, the well-dressed, respectable woman versus the homeless stranger. To many, the conclusion was already clear before a single fact had been established. "I've seen him before," murmured Mrs. Henderson, the self-appointed neighborhood watch leader, adjusting her tennis visor. "He's been sitting on that park bench near the library for weeks." "I always knew he was trouble," Mr. Rodriguez, a local contractor, added with a shake of his head. "They come into our neighborhoods, and this is what happens." Only a handful of voices dared to question the unfolding narrative. "But look at the dog," whispered Kim Patterson, a nurse who had recently moved to the neighborhood. "She's not scared of him. If he really took her, wouldn't she be trying to run back to her owner?" Kim's words lingered, but they were drowned out by the growing tension. The distant hum of an approaching police cruiser sent a ripple through the crowd. The flashing red and blue lights painted the scene in ominous color. It was no longer just an argument. It was an incident. Sarah took a deep breath, steadied herself, and turned to face the arriving officer as if she had already won. "Officer, this man took my dog. Arrest him." Officer Michael Brady stepped out of the patrol car, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the situation. With over 20 years on the force, he had seen this play out before. Two people, both convinced they were right, and a crowd hungry for a resolution. He exhaled slowly before speaking. "All right, let's slow down. I need to hear both sides of the story." Sarah wasted no time. "I let Daisy out into the backyard, just like I always do. And somehow, she ended up here, in his hands. He must have taken her." She turned to the crowd for support, and a few nods of agreement followed. The homeless man, still kneeling beside Daisy, remained silent for a moment before finally responding. "I didn't steal her," he repeated, voice firm yet calm. "She was wandering alone, heading toward the street. I saved her from getting hit by a car." A murmur spread through the crowd. Some looked at Daisy again, noticing how she had nestled against the man, her tail wagging gently, as if offering reassurance. Officer Brady narrowed his eyes. Did anyone actually see him take the dog? Silence. People had assumed, jumped to conclusions, but no one had witnessed the exact moment Daisy had left her yard. Kim stepped forward hesitantly. I was driving when I saw her. She ran into the street, right in front of my car." He pulled her back just in time. Sarah's face twisted with doubt, but she wasn't ready to let go of her anger just yet. Then why was he holding on to her like she was his? She snapped. The homeless man took a deep breath, then reached into his pocket, pulling out a single worn photograph. It was folded at the edges, the ink slightly faded. He held it out. "Because she reminds me of someone I lost," he said softly. The crowd fell silent, drawn to the raw emotion in his voice. Even Sarah hesitated for a second. Officer Brady took the photograph and studied it. It showed a younger version of the man, standing beside a golden retriever, smiling, a real, unguarded smile. "Her name was Lucy," the man continued, voice thick with something deeper than just words. "She was my dog, my family, before I lost everything." A new weight settled over the scene, one that had nothing to do with accusations and everything to do with understanding. Sarah looked down at Daisy. The dog, oblivious to human conflict, wagged her tail gently, glancing between her and the homeless man, as if she too was waiting for what would happen next. The moment hung in the air, a fragile balance between prejudice and truth. And then, just as the first autumn leaves drifted onto the pavement, the situation took a turn no one could have predicted. When perception meets reality. The weight of the moment pressed down on the gathered crowd as the photograph passed from Officer Brady's calloused hands back to the homeless man. The faint creases in the image, the soft wear on its edges, spoke of years spent folded and unfolded, a silent testament to a life once filled with love and companionship. Sarah Thompson, still clutching her phone, stared at the photo as though it might betray a hidden lie. But there was none. The resemblance between Daisy and the dog in the picture was undeniable. Yet, she refused to let go of her anger. "That doesn't explain why you were holding on to my dog," she pressed, her voice laced with skepticism. "Just because you had a dog like her doesn't mean you didn't take Daisy." The homeless man, whose name no one had bothered to ask yet, met Sarah's glare without flinching. "I didn't hold on to her for me," he said quietly, rubbing Daisy's ear absent-mindedly. "I held on to her because she was heading straight for danger. She ran into the road. If I hadn't stepped in, that car would have hit her." His words sliced through the hostility in the air, redirecting the attention to the only other person who could confirm his claim, Kim Patterson, the ER nurse. Kim swallowed, stepping forward. She had spent the past 10 years saving lives, making split-second decisions, yet she never imagined she'd be mediating a neighborhood standoff over a dog. "It's true," she said, her voice steady. "I was driving when it happened. The dog ran right in front of my car. If this man hadn't pulled her back..." She trailed off, the unspoken ending of her sentence hanging in the air. She didn't run immediately back to Sarah. Instead, she turned to James, nuzzling his hand one last time before trotting over to her owner. A lump formed in Sarah's throat as she reached for Daisy's fur, but her gaze remained locked on James. She had spent years building walls, protecting herself from pain, from loss. Daisy had been her safe place, the one thing that had brought her comfort after losing Emily. But maybe, just maybe, she wasn't the only one who had found solace in the presence of a gentle soul. She looked at James again, really looked at him, and saw not a threat, not an intruder, but a man who had loved and lost just like she had. And for the first time since this all began, her anger faded completely. She swallowed hard, glancing down at Daisy, who looked up at her with trusting eyes. Then, with a deep breath, she made a decision that would change everything. "Do you have anywhere to be tonight?" she asked. James blinked, caught off guard. "No," he admitted. Sarah hesitated only for a second before nodding. "Then maybe you should stay for dinner." The crowd murmured in surprise, but no one objected. Because somehow, in the span of just a few moments, this had stopped being a story about a stolen dog and had become one about redemption, second chances, and the unexpected kindness of a woman who was finally ready to let someone in. The shift in the crowd was palpable. Whispers exchanged between neighbors, eyes flickering between Sarah and the homeless man. A few people lowered their phones, realizing this wasn't the neat, black and white story they had initially assumed. Officer Brady exhaled slowly, his years on the force telling him that cases like these were rarely as they first appeared. He had learned to watch for the details people missed, the way a person carried themselves, the hesitation in their voice, the unspoken truth between the lines. He turned his attention back to the man. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice firm but not unkind. The man hesitated, as if remembering who he was before the world had stripped him down to nothing more than the homeless guy on the bench. "James," he finally answered. "James Anderson." The name triggered something in Officer Brady's memory, a faint recollection buried beneath years of routine police calls and reports. "Dr. Anderson?" he asked, his brows knitting together. "The veterinarian." A murmur spread through the crowd. Some of them had unknowingly passed him on the street every day, never realizing that the man they dismissed as just another vagrant was once a respected member of the community. James nodded slowly. "Used to be." His words carried the weight of a past long lost. Sarah's expression faltered for the first time. She had expected a thief, a liar, someone who would shrink under confrontation. She hadn't expected this. "You were a vet?" she asked, as if saying it out loud would make it more real. James gave a small, humorless chuckle. "Yeah, a lifetime ago." Kim's stomach twisted at the realization. She had worked in emergency rooms long enough to know that life could unravel at any moment. One bad diagnosis, one unexpected tragedy, and everything a person had built could come crashing down. She took a slow breath before speaking. "Dr. Anderson, why are you out here?" James's eyes flickered with something raw, something he rarely allowed himself to show. "Because life doesn't always wait for you to catch up," he said simply. "One day, you're saving lives in an operating room. The next, you're choosing between eating and paying for your wife's medical bills." The silence that followed was heavier than before. Even those who had been quick to judge now found themselves shifting uncomfortably. Mrs. Henderson, who had been eager to call him a troublemaker, looked away, suddenly very interested in the cracks on the pavement. Sarah swallowed hard. Her mind raced through everything she thought she knew, everything she had assumed about him, the moment she saw Daisy in his arms. She wasn't ready to back down completely, not yet, but her voice softened. "Why were you at my house?" she asked. "You've been near my yard before. I've seen you." James exhaled, glancing down at Daisy, who was still pressed against him, as if she understood that he needed the comfort more than she did. "I wasn't watching your house," he said. "I was watching her." He scratched Daisy's head gently. "She reminds me of Lucy, the dog in that picture." He paused. "When you lose everything, you hold on to the little things that remind you of the life you had." The honesty in his voice was undeniable. Sarah's grip on her phone loosened, her anger beginning to melt into something she couldn't quite name. Guilt? Understanding? Maybe both. Officer Brady studied the scene once more before nodding. "There's no crime here," he said finally, glancing at Sarah. "No theft, no trespassing. Just a misunderstanding." His tone left no room for argument. Sarah exhaled, looking at Daisy, her Daisy, who was still nestled against James. And for the first time, she really saw what everyone else had noticed from the beginning. Daisy wasn't afraid. She trusted him. Sarah took a slow, measured step forward, and knelt beside them. "Daisy," she called softly. The golden retriever perked up, ears twitching, but didn't move right away. James hesitated, then gently released her collar, and Daisy did what no one expected. An unexpected invitation and a shared wound. The murmur in the crowd slowly faded as Sarah's words hung in the cool autumn air. "Then maybe you should stay for dinner." James Anderson, once a man of quiet dignity, now reduced to a stranger on the fringes of society, stared at her as if he had misheard. A dinner invitation. From the woman who just accused him of stealing her dog. For a moment, it seemed as if the entire world had stopped moving. The neighbors who had been so quick to whisper, so eager to pick sides, suddenly found themselves at a loss for words. James, still crouched beside Daisy, looked down at his own hands, rough and calloused from years of survival, then back at Sarah. Her expression was guarded, but there was something else beneath it. Hesitation, uncertainty, maybe even guilt. He could see it, feel it. This wasn't about pity. This was about something deeper. And then, quietly, carefully, he nodded. "All right," he said. "Dinner it is." The walk back, a silent understanding. Officer Brady, satisfied that there was no crime to resolve, gave a small nod before stepping back toward his cruiser. He had seen enough in his years on the force to know that this wasn't just about a dog. It was about two people who had lost something precious and were only now realizing that maybe, just maybe, they could help each other heal. The crowd, sensing the moment had passed, began to dissipate. Some shook their heads, others gave curious glances, but no one protested. As Sarah turned toward her house, Daisy trotting happily at her side, she glanced over her shoulder at James. He hesitated for just a moment before standing, dusting himself off and following her lead. Kim Patterson, the ER nurse who had witnessed the entire ordeal, smiled softly to herself before heading toward her own home. There was something profoundly human about what had just transpired. Two strangers finding an unlikely connection in the most unexpected of ways. James walked a few steps behind Sarah, his eyes scanning the neighborhood as they moved. He had walked these streets countless times, unnoticed and ignored. But now, with Sarah leading the way and Daisy bouncing between them, it felt different. He wasn't invisible anymore. Crossing the threshold, a house full of memories. When they reached the Thompson residence, James hesitated at the gate. He had never been invited into a home in years. The last time he had walked through a front door like this, Catherine was still alive, and Lucy was still at his side. Sarah paused on the porch, noticing his hesitation. She exhaled softly. "It's just dinner," she said, though her own voice held an unspoken weight. James finally nodded and stepped forward. The moment he crossed the threshold, it was as if he had entered another world. The house was warm, not just in temperature, but in presence. The smell of freshly baked bread and roasted chicken lingered in the air, and the soft glow of autumn candles flickered along the kitchen counter. But what caught James's eye the most were the photographs. They lined the walls, filled the bookshelves, snapshots of a life carefully curated and preserved. There were images of Sarah and her husband Tom, standing proudly in front of their Victorian home, their arms wrapped around a young girl with a bright, dimpled smile. James had seen grief before, and he knew, without asking, that the girl in those photographs wasn't here anymore. Sarah caught his gaze and followed his eyes to the mantel, where one particular frame sat slightly apart from the rest. A single candle burned beside it, its flame steady and unwavering. Emily. James didn't ask. He didn't need to. He understood. Sarah cleared her throat, suddenly self-conscious. "Come on," she said, turning toward the dining room. "Let's eat before Daisy convinces us to give her everything on our plates." James gave a small chuckle at that. Daisy wagged her tail expectantly, as if she knew she was the unspoken link between these two souls, the bridge between past wounds and an uncertain but hopeful future. A conversation between strangers. Dinner started in silence. James sat at the dining table, his hands resting awkwardly on his lap. The polished wood felt unfamiliar beneath his fingers. Sarah moved with practiced ease, setting down plates with quiet precision. For a while, there were only the soft sounds of utensils clinking, Daisy's occasional sniff near the table, and the distant hum of evening settling over Vermont Street. And then, finally, Sarah broke the silence. "You said her name was Lucy." James looked up. "Yeah, my golden retriever." Sarah nodded slowly, as if piecing something together. "She meant a lot to you, didn't she?" James let out a small breath. "She was everything. My wife and I. We never had kids, but Lucy, she was our family. She was there through everything. The best thing I ever did was adopt her." A pause. "And the worst thing I ever did was lose her." Sarah's fingers tightened around her glass of water. She understood loss in a way few did. "What happened?" she asked softly. James hesitated, then spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "Catherine got sick. Cancer. We fought it as hard as we could. But the treatments..." He shook his head. "They drained everything we had. Our savings. Our house. I sold my practice, thinking it would be enough. But it never was." Sarah listened, her chest tightening with something she hadn't expected. "After she passed, I tried to hold on. But the bills, the debt, everything came crashing down." He swallowed hard. "I lost Lucy after that. Not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't afford to keep her." Silence. Then Sarah spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I lost my daughter." James looked at her, his eyes searching hers. Sarah took a slow breath. 5 years ago. A distracted driver. 1 second she was there, and the next. Her voice faltered. "I thought I wouldn't survive it. I shut everyone out. My husband threw himself into work. And Daisy, she gave a small, bittersweet smile. She was the only thing that kept me going." James nodded. He didn't offer empty words or hollow sympathy. Instead, he simply said, "I get it." And somehow, that was enough. They sat in silence, not as strangers anymore, but as two people who had walked through fire and somehow found themselves here, not whole, not healed, but maybe, just maybe, on the road to something new. Sarah exhaled, running a hand through Daisy's fur as the golden retriever lay content between them. "You don't have anywhere to stay, do you?" she finally asked. James hesitated. "Not really." Sarah looked at him for a long moment. "Then stay," she said. "At least for tonight." James blinked. "You sure?" Sarah nodded. "Daisy trusts you. And I think I do too." And for the first time in a long time, James felt something he had forgotten was possible. Hope. A new beginning in the most unexpected place. The weight of the evening settled softly over Vermont Street. The autumn air had turned crisp, rustling through the trees as the last golden leaves drifted onto quiet sidewalks. Inside the Thompson house, the dinner plates had been cleared, the candles had burned lower, and the air was filled with something far heavier than words. Understanding. James sat back in his chair, staring at the remnants of the meal before him. It had been a long time since he had eaten at a proper table, surrounded by warmth that wasn't just physical but emotional. Across from him, Sarah absent-mindedly ran her fingers through Daisy's fur, lost in thought. Neither of them had planned for this night to unfold the way it did. Neither of them had expected to find a piece of themselves in the other. Sarah glanced at the clock. The time had slipped away unnoticed, much like the walls she had built around herself. "I should probably get you some blankets," she said, pushing back her chair. "The couch isn't the most comfortable, but it'll do for the night." James nodded. "That'd be great. Thank you." The words felt too small for what she was offering. She disappeared down the hallway, leaving him alone with Daisy, who now lay sprawled at his feet, as if she had already decided he belonged there. James let out a small chuckle, reaching down to scratch behind her ears. "You're something else, you know that," he murmured. Daisy's tail thumped against the hardwood floor. Content. Sarah returned with an armful of blankets and set them down on the couch. "It's been a while since I've had a guest," she admitted, smoothing the fabric absent-mindedly. "I hope it's enough." James smiled. "It's more than enough." She hesitated before sitting down on the opposite end of the couch. For a long moment, there was only silence. And then Sarah spoke, her voice quieter than before. "You said something earlier," she began, "that when you lose everything, you hold on to the little things that remind you of the life you had." James nodded. She swallowed. "For me, Daisy was that little thing." She paused, inhaling slowly before continuing. "I spent years keeping people at a distance. Losing Emily shattered me. And after that, I didn't have room for anything or anyone else." She gave a small, sad smile. "It was easier to keep moving, to fill my days with routines, to make sure Daisy was okay, because she was all I had left." James listened, understanding in a way few could. "But tonight," she continued, "I realized that maybe I wasn't just protecting Daisy. Maybe I was protecting myself. From more loss. From feeling too much." She exhaled, glancing at him. "And I think, maybe you've been doing the same thing." James looked down at his hands. He had spent so long surviving, moving from place to place, carrying the weight of memories like a burden too heavy to set down. But maybe, just maybe, it was time. "Maybe we both have," he admitted. Sarah nodded, as if coming to terms with something unspoken. A comfortable silence settled between them. And then, almost as if she hadn't planned to say it, she spoke the words that would change everything. "You know, I could use some help around here." James blinked. "What?" She hesitated for only a second before pressing forward. "Daisy's getting older. She'll need more care soon. And well, I could use someone who understands that." James studied her, searching for hesitation, for doubt. But there was none. She was offering something rare, something precious, a second chance. "You don't have to decide now," she added quickly, as if suddenly unsure of herself. I wanted you to know that you don't have to keep wandering. Not if you don't want to." The words settled deep in his chest. James had spent so long thinking he had no place left to go, no purpose beyond the memories of what he had lost. But maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong. Maybe this was exactly where he was meant to be. He looked down at Daisy, who gazed up at him with trusting eyes. He looked at Sarah, who for the first time in years had let someone in. And then, with a small, quiet smile, he nodded. "I'd like that," he said. And just like that, two people, each broken in their own way, found a new beginning in the most unexpected place. Not as strangers, not as lost souls, but as two people who had finally found something worth holding on to again. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.